Absolutely right. And then, so Jerry, you mentioned the industry is typically putting these into documents. So what does this data look like when we actually pull this off of a device? Why is the industry putting this into documents? What is, what are you seeing, and what are some of your recommendations on managing this type of data? Because it is all flat data, and what's that next step with it? Who would like to start here, Melissa?
Sure. So, and I think I'm a good person to start because as a practical matter, I think that this is incredibly difficult. Lawyers are used to looking at this sort of evidence as a document, and consider why. I mean, when we have to attach it to some sort of a brief, that's a document. At trial, a lot of times it's going to be easier to show this sort of thing in some sort of an image. So at the same time, we want that image that we're attaching to the brief that we're showing at trial to look good. It should look like as close to like what it looks like when we as the end users are actually using this functionality. So this is tough for me because I do want to shove these square pegs of modern data types into the round hole of documents. And I think that the sort of the happy place that we land is the technology that we have that at least does a really nice job with taking the native and sort of keeping it looking like the native. And so even if we do need to eventually convert it into something that's more document-like, at least it looks like it looked when the end users were using it. And this stuff is critical because as a lawyer, I'm trying to tell my story. And the only way to tell a story very often is just that. It's preserving the context of all the different ways that people are talking. Sometimes people are switching the ways that they're talking mid-conversation, and the only way to actually complete the conversation, understand what happened, is to switch back and forth between communication platforms. So, for me, that's the importance, but also the struggle.
Yeah, and definitely understand that. What we have found is that keeping it in a near native representation of that data, so it looks like a document, but you can do things like tag individual items. Obviously that's what CloudNine does, but it has created a better process than what we have seen of dragging redaction boxes around whole swaths of text messages and all of that. So we'll talk a bit more, but I know everyone here is chomping at the bit to contribute to this part of the conversation. So Alicia, why don't you kick us off?
I was just going to piggyback on both the things you guys just said. I think Melissa makes really good points about how we use data as lawyers in litigation. And so why do lawyers want it to look a certain way? Because that's how we're trying to use it in trial and in depositions. I think that's important. But one of the hurdles, and Rick, you were starting to address this, one of the hurdles is we have document review platforms that they're changing, obviously they're evolving, but they sort of are the same they've always been. And we're trying to, this is part of the square peg in a round hole. We're trying to shove new types of data into review platforms that really were originally built to just deal with electronic photocopies of documents like emails and even text messages. So, I think that's part of the evolution here, is not just how do we collect data from structured databases, but how do we review it? Because our review platforms are not equipped to handle a lot of structured data. And so I think that's part of the issue too, right? And then to Melissa's point of, okay, well then how are we going to use it once we've reviewed it and figured out what we need to, how are we now going to use that in a deposition or something?
Absolutely. Jerry or Aaron?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what Melissa said, and I think that that's something that on the forensic side, or just collection in general, that we really have to keep in mind when we're talking about structured data is the authenticity and the completeness of a collection is extremely important. But we need to keep in mind the idea of the end goal is really the presentation, right? It's how do you take that data? How do you put it into a visually appealing format that makes sense, that clearly but concisely can convey the point of what that data is saying. And so I think that that's a hugely important fact that we on the collection side have traditionally kind of struggled with, in the sense of, again, we're talking about data points. We're not talking about physical documents that we can do this representation like you're used to in most of your review platforms, and you can just go ahead and image and put a bait number on. It really is more complex than that, and it's all intertwined and connected. And so that idea of being able to keep it near native visualization, I think assists not only in that final presentation and how it comes across to your audience, but also helps assist in that review, because that's the other piece of this that I think that is important to keep in mind. That I think for most legal teams, they're used to the idea of, oh goodness, I've got 25,000 documents in this email collection that I've now got to review. When you're talking about text messages, we can easily hit 6 figures, no problem, on a single device. And if you start looking at multiple custodians and multiple sources, the numbers of items that really do need to at least be considered for review is a much higher clip. And so the more that we can keep that review piece of it as easy as possible is also important as well.
Yeah, and I think the definition of native here depends on where your perspective is, or what seat you're at looking at this from, is because the bubble chat on this graphic looks like the native. But the way that we pull the data out, what's native to the forensic examiner acquiring this information is columns and rows. It's the structured data, right? And by the way, they don't come out as Excel spreadsheets from these systems. So what we're looking at here primarily is what's captured from a phone, but we can't take a full physical image of the phone. There's been security lockdowns from Apple and Google that prevent us from doing that. So our ability to capture forensic images are limited. In fact, if we're dealing with cloud platforms like Slack and M365, or some of these other platforms where the data is coming out as structured data, and that's all we're allowed to get, we're kind of at the mercy of the data source provider. So we have to work with that. And if it's columns and rows and they come out as CSV, or they come out as JSON or XML, someone's going to need to do the transformation of that data once authenticated to put it back into a high fidelity representation of how users normally see this information. It's that kind of human, more familiar representation of the data that makes more sense for review and production. But all of the activities that happen in the glue as we move data from one place to the next is typically in structured data format.